Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to World Have Your Say. By far the most followed story in the world today is this attack claimed by the Pakistan Taliban as revenge for the death of Osama bin Laden. We're going to get your reaction and speak to our two main guests about it. Jan Egeland is a former UN head of humanitarian affairs, and Nick Kristof of the New York Times is followed by over 1 million of you on Twitter. Also, with more EU countries expressing concern about the number of refugees coming from North Africa, we'll discuss how best to help those who've had their lives turned upside down by the unrest of the Arab Spring. And remember, wherever you're watching BBC World News, you're very welcome to take part. Hi there, good to have your company today. Remember, if ever you want to take part in the discussions on World Have Your Say, all our contact details are on the screen throughout the show. And we're going to begin by looking at some of the main stories today. Of course, our lead story is those two bomb attacks on a paramilitary force academy near Peshawar in northwest Pakistan. It's killed at least 80 people. The Pakistani Taliban say they carried out the attack to avenge the death of Osama bin Laden. Elsewhere in Syria, thousands of people are taking part in anti-government protest marches in towns and cities across the country following Friday prayers. There are reports that one man's been shot by security forces in the city of Homs. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court says he'll seek arrest warrants for 3 senior Libyan leaders for murder and persecution. The Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, is expected to be among them. 8 Eurozone countries have released their first quarter growth figures. Now, Germany has powered ahead. Greece, surprisingly, reports a jump in output despite its austerity measures, but the Portuguese economy does appear to be floundering. And 34 years in power, now West Bengal's communist government has been voted out. The main opposition party has won a landslide. Well, our guest for both editions of World Have Your Say today on BBC World News is Jan Egeland, the former UN Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief. He joins us live from Oslo. Sir, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Now, while you worked for the UN, your remit was around the world. You know Pakistan very well. What's your view of the situation there and how Pakistanis can be supported in getting through these attacks from Islamist militants?
I'm very worried for Pakistan. I'm very worried for further turmoil, further internal strife. It's been now catastrophic years already. Last year we saw, I think, some 70 suicide attacks in Pakistan. I think people in the West have to understand that it's really in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, where the majority of terrorist attacks are. It's not in the West, it's not on the West, it's in these countries, but it's also there. The terrorist problem has to be solved in the sense that people have to be prevented from joining extremist groups. The civilian government has to be strengthened. The military, which has a dominant role, and the intelligence services, which seems to act completely as a state in the state, has to cooperate in fighting terror and in fighting internal divisions.
Well, those of you watching, if you've got questions for Jan Egeland about any humanitarian issues raised in Pakistan or in the Arab world as well, do get in touch. All the contact details are on the screen. Now, Rick Newman has tweeted us to say Pakistan can't win. It's blamed by the US for harbouring bin Laden, then attacked by al-Qaeda for not protecting him. At least Pakistan should pick one side, says Rick. And Jan Egeland, I wonder whether, when you look at Pakistan, you see humanitarian solutions or military solutions.
Well, I do not see military solutions. I see that the military and the security forces work under civilian control to fight armed extremism. What is extremely worrying is the following, and these are figures I got when I visited Pakistan. You know, you go back to the time before the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan and before the West started to arm Mujahideen groups from Peshawar and from Pakistan to fight the Soviet occupation. that time, there may have been a handful of extremist armed groups in Pakistan fighting to change the constitutional order there. Now there may be 200 groups of all sorts and all over the country. It's a tremendous problem, and what we should understand is that it's not going to be a solution in terms of peace and stability in neither Pakistan nor in Afghanistan if there is not a solution in both of them. On the humanitarian front is also very worrying. It's one of the countries in the world with the greatest divide between the haves and the have-nots. The poverty gap is tremendous. The social redistribution is really faltering, is really lacking in that country. So there has to be an enormous investment with Pakistan, but first and foremost there has to be change within Pakistan, and the civilian government has to be changed and has to become less corrupt.
Well, that is the analysis of Jan Egeland of how to start addressing the problem of Islamist extremism in Pakistan. If you're in Pakistan watching BBC World News, or indeed wherever you are in the world, do you agree with that analysis? By all means, call us up live. It's country code 44 2070 83 72 72, or send us an email, worldhaveyousay@bbc.com. The team will pick up your message. If you put your phone number as well, we'll do our very best to get you either on the air here on BBC World News or on BBC World Service Radio. Now, joining the conversation with Jan Egeland live from Oslo is Rabia Sultan, who is live with us from Lahore. Rabia, what's your reaction to this attack?
Thank you very much for having me on the program. And I would agree with the gentleman who just spoke from Oslo. Actually, we need to look at this scenario as an aftermath of post-Soviet war, what it did to Pakistan, the social fabric of Pakistan, how it was disturbed. And other than that, when the United States left Pakistan, I'm talking about the 90s, what it did was that it left these groups, namely the Mujahideens, and at that time they were the blue-eyed people of United States, and they helped them create. So they just left them high and dry in Afghanistan and, Pakistan. So things have been growing up, and what we see in face of Osama bin Laden is continuation of the same policies, of the same objectives the United States wanted, because it was they could not digest Russia as a superpower.
Okay.
So
Rabia, you're giving us a number of thoughts here. Let's bring in Tazeen, who's in Islamabad, to respond to some of them. So we have Jan Egeland in Oslo, Rabia in Pakistan, in Lahore, and now Tazeen in Islamabad. Tazeen, do you agree that to understand what's happening in Pakistan with Islamist extremism, we have to go back to the 90s and even to the 1980s?
Yes, in a way, because you see the seeds were sown during that time. But if we but if you focus on the current attack that happened today, I think we need to focus on a couple of more things. For instance, they say that the TTP claimed that it was in retaliation to the assassination of Osama bin Laden by Americans. And the government of Pakistan actually did not they never actually claimed that they know about the attacks per se. So imagine if the government actually had taken part and they have done it, it would have been even more disastrous.
Well, it would have been disastrous, but it's worth saying we just don't know what, if any, government involvement there was in supporting bin Laden. Of course, President Obama said he wanted an investigation. Prime Minister Gilani said there would be an investigation, but has already said the ISI is a national asset. I just wonder, Jan Egeland, all three of you have highlighted issues well into the past, in the 1990s and the 1980s. Shouldn't we be focusing rather on Pakistan's institutions now and whether they are capable of fighting Islamist extremism?
Yes, of course. We have to focus on what are the future challenges and how to get out of this truly vicious cycle. But of course, we also have to learn from the mistakes of the past. The West has to learn. Pakistan has to learn. India has to learn, every actor in the region. We need to see also, you know, a real dialogue between Pakistan and India. There has to be a new beginning between these two countries. I'm constantly referring to the fact that you must have accountability for the military in Pakistan and the ISI, the interintelligence services. All of this needs to be done now, at the same time as there has to be a forceful campaign against those religious groups, those madrasas, those places who do brainwash young people into becoming extremists.
I'm interested, Jan Egeland, though, that while some Indians are suggesting there should be a cooling of the relationship with Pakistan because of what's been happening with bin Laden, you're actually suggesting the opposite, that a new friendship is essential to fighting the Islamists. If you're watching in India, what do you make of those comments from Jan Egeland? Do call us up, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Now, we've said goodbye to Rabia in Lahore. Many thanks to her. And let's bring in Nicholas Kristof, columnist for the New York Times. He joins us live from the paper's TV studio. Over 1 million of you follow him on Twitter. Nicholas, thanks for your time today.
Sure, my pleasure.
What's your reaction to these attacks in northwest Pakistan?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a reminder of the challenges that do face the Pakistani government as well. And to me, I guess I've been concerned that there is this attitude in the U.S. that Pakistan has betrayed us, that they're continuing to do that, that $3 billion a year just isn't buying the kind of loyalty that it should. And as a result, some kind of pressure toward the U.S. abandoning Pakistan. And to me, that's kind of the wrong tactic. That the basic problem here is that Pakistan distrusts America, and when we respond by threatening abandonment, I think that just underscores the distrust and makes it even harder to do some kind of to build a real relationship.
You say build a real relationship. As you're talking, we can see pictures of a demonstration in Pakistan in support of the ISI, the intelligence agency, which has been criticised by many of you who watch BBC World News. Jan Egeland, come in here and speak with Nicholas Kristof. It's all very well talking about improving relationships, but America's been trying that for years. How to actually achieve that?
Well, I completely agree with Nick that this has to, there has to be a long-term Western involvement. The U.S. has to stay the course. One of the painful lessons of the past was that it was actually a mistake to build up all of these mujahideen with great dollars from America and from Europe, and then leave.
Let me interrupt you. You're saying stay the course. I want to hear from both you and Nicholas Kristof. Maybe, Nicholas, you could go first, and Jan Egeland, you could pick up. What does staying the course mean? What does developing new links and friendships with Pakistan mean in practicalities? Nicholas first.
Well, I think that the basic problem has been that the U.S. has had a relationship with Pakistani generals and with some Pakistani politicians. We haven't had a relationship with Pakistan as a nation. And I think we need to do a better job trying to do that, to build civil society, not just to write checks to generals, which to me has been kind of counterproductive, and it has resulted in this distorted Pakistani state where you have all kinds of money, 7 times as much money going to the military as to schools in Pakistan. When the greatest threat Pakistan faces is not India, is simply illiteracy. So I think that we need to broaden that relationship. I also think that, frankly, we can put more pressure on India to try to soothe that India-Pakistan relationship and especially work toward a deal on Kashmir, which in the long run is going to be the best way to reduce radicalism in Pakistan.
I completely agree with that. I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring, you can explain that more than anything by education. There has been more education in the Arab world. There is a new generation of Arab people. They don't want the old corrupt regimes. They don't want the old military regimes. They want democracy. They want accountability. We want to see that as well in Pakistan. In addition to the U.S. staying the course and going more civilian and less military, of course, India has to play its constructive part. It is the big brother. The little brother has been paranoid, yes, but the bigger has to reach out again and again. And the third fact I would like to point to is China. China is playing a very important role vis-à-vis Pakistan. Pakistan feels it has a good relationship to China. The world is changing. It's not only the West, it's also China that has to play a constructive role in helping the good forces in Pakistan.
Jan Egeland, you're live with us from Oslo. Nicholas Kristof is live with us from the offices of the New York Times. Many thanks to Tazeen in Islamabad, who's been speaking with us. If you're watching and want to talk with Nicholas Kristof and Jan Egeland, just call us up, tweet us, text us, get in touch through Facebook. They're live and they're all ready to speak with you. We're going to pause for a couple of minutes before we carry on talking about the situation in Pakistan. I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks for tuning to BBC World News and for joining me for World Have Your Say. Any number of stories you're following very closely online. Number one amongst those would be the attack claimed by the Pakistan Taliban in the northwest of the country, which it says is revenge for the death of Osama bin Laden. We also know lots of you are very keen to speak to Jan Egeland, former UN humanitarian chief, and Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times about the situation with the various Arab Spring protests. We'll move on to that in a few minutes' time. But if you want to call in and make a point about that, give us a ring now and we'll be happy to speak to you a little bit later. Now, let me pull up a message that's come in on our Facebook page from Baka Daniel, who says, terrorism existed long before Osama. He collected it all under one roof called Al-Qaeda. If we haven't settled the issue of domestic frustrations that give birth to extremism, it's too early to think of finished in this struggle. And Nicholas Kristof, lots of our viewers are saying that this attack today proves that killing bin Laden was high profile, but fundamentally low impact in the campaign against Al-Qaeda.
I mean, I think there's a point there, but I wouldn't exaggerate it, I guess. It is certainly true that there are enormous problems that go far beyond Osama bin Laden, far beyond Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, it's also true that after 9/11, within the first hour, every counterterrorism expert knew that the person behind this must have been Osama bin Laden, because there simply weren't that many terrorist networks that were capable of that kind of attack. So I think removing bin Laden from the picture is important, but does it end the threat? Absolutely not.
Jan Egeland?
Well, I mean, one thing I take heart from is the following. The number of people dead from terror, defined as politically, religiously, ideologically motivated violence against civilians, that's the definition of terror. It's been worse in the 1990s than it's been the last few years. Very many countries have made progress in combating terror. They've gotten extremists to not take up violence. It can succeed in many places in the world, and Al-Qaeda is less strong now than it was. In most countries, there's actually been progress to combat terror, and we can continue that progress.
Well, Jan Egeland in Oslo, Nicholas Kristof in New York. Let's bring in Saad in Islamabad to talk with you, who's a blogger on Pakistani military issues at abdullahsaad.com. Saad, thanks very much for joining in. What's your analysis of the situation in your country after this attack?
Well, Pakistan was always going to be the easiest targets for Al-Qaeda and any of their affiliate terrorist organizations. They're right here, they're in the country. So we are going to bear the price for the attack that took place against Osama bin Laden. And if I have to make a point here that the disdain shown towards the number of dead Pakistanis, there are over 30,000 Pakistanis dead in this war, just demoralizes us all the more in war against terror, because we get whipped on both ends. At one hand, we are bearing a price for a terrorist leader through terrorist attacks, and on the other hand, we do not get recognized for our own efforts in the war against terror.
Well, Saad, let's put that point to Jan Egeland, who was the UN humanitarian chief. Jan Egeland, do you think that perhaps the watching world forgets the human cost that Pakistan is paying?
Absolutely. I tried to say that initially. You know, it's not the West that is most threatened by terror. It is precisely Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, the Sudan. I mean, it's that kind of countries where the highest terror toll is. At the same time, you know, there is no solution to this but that Pakistanis themselves are able to deal with the enormous internal divisions, the enormous divisive factors internally, get a credible government that is delivering real services to the people, get a transparency and dialogue and so on, and that we can, from the West, from India, from China, play a constructive, supporting a role long term.
And Nicholas Kristof, you obviously work for one of the great institutions of the American media. Do you think the human cost in Pakistan is adequately reported to Americans?
You know, there are all kinds of things we don't adequately report, and it may well be that we should put that in that category. But I think this also reflects one of the real frustrations that we as Americans feel, because, you know, to us it really does seem as if the great threats to Pakistan in the future do come from radicalism. They do come from the Pakistani Taliban, from other radical groups in the country, from the illiteracy that we talked about a little bit earlier. And then we see so many resources going toward in the Pakistani state, going toward move troops over to the eastern border confronting India, or to building up nuclear weapons, which aren't going to do much good defending against either illiteracy or domestic radicalism. And so it's our perception that those threats and that cost of terrorism and violence and radicalism are very real, and we don't understand why the Pakistani military is not confronting those challenges and rather is confronting what they perceive as the Indian threat.
Well, Nicholas and Jan, while you're talking with some of our contributors from Pakistan, lots of people are calling up from around the world. Let's cross to the World Have You Say news desk, where Mahfouz from the team can tell us who's been getting in touch.
Hi, Ross. Yes, as you can see, we're being inundated by calls here from all over the world. And like always, they're coming from across the world, from Pakistan, Mauritius, Somalia, and many other countries. Most of our callers have mixed feelings, though, as to whether today's Taliban attack is a revenge. In fact, I overheard one caller saying this happens all the time. One caller from Mauritius said that the U.S. had made a hero out of bin Laden by killing him. And finally, a reminder to our viewers that if you want to join in the conversation and you are on Twitter, you can use the hashtag WHYS.
Mahfouz, thanks very much indeed. Yes, but WHYS as a hashtag if you want to tweet us as the conversation's going along. Other calls coming in from Somalia, Canada, the Philippines and Morocco. Farhan in Pakistan has used that hashtag to say the US must work seriously on reducing anti-American sentiment in Pakistan. An easy thing to say, Nicholas, but how do you suggest America goes about that?
Well, I think we have to do real outreach to the Pakistani people. And right now, our strategy in Pakistan has largely been to have relationships with the ISI, with the military, with the president. And we need to have a relationship with the Pakistani people. And that is something that historically we haven't really had. After the floods, I think that Ambassador Holbrooke did a superb job of really trying to provide assistance and making it clear that, you know, we're in Pakistan for the long haul. I think that since his passing, that, you know, we haven't really had that kind of an effort.
And if you're watching in the States, how do you think you might be able to improve your reputation, America's reputation in Pakistan? By all means, get in touch. Thanks to Jan Egeland, Nicholas Kristof, and all of our other contributors. We're going to carry on this conversation in the second edition of World Have Your Say in a couple of minutes' time. Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. If you're new to World Have Your Say, it brings together global news and discussion on the radio, online, and of course, on the television. And there are a number of stories that you're following closely at the moment. As you'll know, in Pakistan, at least 80 people have died in what the Pakistan Taliban is calling a revenge attack. We've got news that Hosni Mubarak's wife has been taken into custody in Egypt. That's being retweeted by thousands of you. There's also lots of interest in the protests in Syria and Yemen. And the EU looks set to agree that freedom of movement can be restricted in exceptional circumstances, such as the Arab Spring and the refugee crisis it's helped to create. Well, the former UN head of humanitarian affairs, Jan Egeland, is live with us to talk through that issue. And wherever you're watching, remember, you're all very welcome to get involved. Yes, if you have any questions for Jan Egeland about the humanitarian situation created by the Arab Spring, all the contact details are on the screen here on BBC World News. Send him a message, call in if you'd like to speak with him, and we'll start putting your points to Jan Egeland in a couple of minutes' time. First of all, though, let's get the latest news here on the BBC, beginning with those 2 bomb attacks on a paramilitary force academy near Peshawar in northwest Pakistan. As I was saying, at least 80 people have been killed. The Pakistani Taliban said they carried out the attack to avenge the death of Osama bin Laden. Meanwhile, in Syria, thousands of people have been taking part in anti-government protest marches in towns and cities across the country, all following Friday prayers. There are reports that 1 man has been shot dead by security forces in Homs. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court says he's going to seek arrest warrants for 3 senior Libyan leaders for murder and persecution. One of them is expected to be the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. 8 Eurozone countries have released their first quarter growth figures. Germany has powered ahead. Greece reports a jump in output despite its austerity measures. That may surprise you, but Portuguese economy does appear to be floundering. And after 34 years in power, West Bengal's communist government is voted out. The main opposition party has won a landslide victory. Jan Egeland joins us live from Oslo. Sir, thanks for being with us on World Have Your Say.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us live is Mina Al-Lami, a research fellow at the London School of Economics who studies in jihadi, specialises in looking at jihadi websites. Mina, thanks to you for joining us as well. First of all, just give us an idea of the kind of reactions you've seen to the death of Osama bin Laden.
Thank you very much. Well, first to comment on the tragic attack today in Peshawar. It doesn't come as a surprise, and it's exactly the type of attacks that I talked about in an analysis earlier this week. And so while what Al-Qaeda groups will try to do in the coming days is carry out attacks in their respective regions. So it will be, for example, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or Pakistan, the Taliban, will try to carry out attacks against soft targets, because carrying out an attack on Western soil, which would be the ultimate target of Al-Qaeda, needs a lot of resources, logistics, and communications. It's not easy to carry out. So to compensate, they will try to step up their operations in their local regions. And one of the commentators or the tweeters I heard said, these are common attacks and they take place every day, which is true. But what Al-Qaeda affiliated groups will try to do is connect this to the killing of bin Laden to prove that they are doing something and that they are relevant.
And Jan Egeland, listening to Mina, clearly the threat continues to exist. Is it possible to quantify the humanitarian cost of Islamist extremism?
No, that would be very tough, really. But it is true, as we just talked about last half hour, that the major cost is borne in the third world, in developing countries, and the countries paying the highest price is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen. It is not the Western countries. The highest price has always been in developing countries. The highest amount of people killed by terror, political terror, ideological terror, cultural terror, was in Africa, as you will know, in the genocides of Central Africa.
Thank you very much indeed for those comments. Now, we are going to carry on talking about the situation in Pakistan on Facebook and also at worldhaveyoursay.com. But for the moment, let's turn our attention to some of the situations in the Arab world. Pulling up a comment from Ruben Isaacs, who posted this question on facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. He says there are reports of medical workers being tortured in Bahrain. Humanitarian agencies are denied access in Syria. If true, what possible measures may be taken to get help to the destitute civilians? Well, before we put that point to Jan Egeland, let's bring in Salman in Bahrain, who joins us live. Salman, you didn't want us to give your job title so you could speak more freely. What kind of assistance would you like from humanitarian agencies?
Well, the best assistance at the moment to get is to actually, know exactly what the true problem or that is happening in Bahrain, not only to use a third or a fourth party media agency to actually report exactly what's going on in Bahrain, because the media also have their own directions and their own sort of they're also biased and exactly covering the situation in Bahrain. So the way they can help is actually to come to Bahrain and to sit with Bahrainis and you know, with local authorities, with regular Bahrainis, and see if we actually do need the help.
But Jan Egeland, how do you negotiate the differing pressures of the media, of the authorities, of the protesters who are against the authorities when you're trying to deliver humanitarian assistance?
The basic principle of humanitarian assistance is that it is impartial, it's neutral, it wants to come to needy people, civilians, irrespective of their background, their creed, their ideology, their religion. Now, the biggest problem of humanitarian relief has been and is and will be access. Unimpeded access in situations of extreme strife, of war. In Libya, there is a denial of access to many places, including in, as you will know, in Misrata, where the war kept people away. I'm very concerned with Bahrain. Yes, there were enormous pressures on the medical sector, for example. And in Syria, there is the regime, the security forces, is making it very hard for organizations to work
but Jan Egeland,
with unimpeded access.
But Jan Egeland, viewers know that it's hard. Salman in Bahrain is telling us it's hard. I suppose what they're asking is, how does someone in the kind of job that you used to do for the UN get over those obstacles, or do you just sit back and say, at the moment, we just can't get in there?
The UN system and the Red Cross, Red Crescent system is constantly pressurizing authorities, armed groups, rebels, government armies to get access. But they need to have permissions and they need to have security. I just finished a report on behalf of the UN system, actually, with colleagues that documented that the last few years has been the most bloody for humanitarian workers of any decade since the Second World War, because humanitarian workers are attacked more by terrorists, but even by parties to conflicts.
Jan Egeland, thanks for responding to those questions. If you're watching, we're live here on World Have Your Say, as ever. Our guest today, Jan Egeland, former UN humanitarian chief. If you want to send him questions, by all means, tweet us with the hashtag WHYS. I can see calls coming in from New Zealand, Thailand, Germany, Denmark, Lesotho, Mauritania, Ethiopia and Indonesia. If we don't get you all onto this edition of World Have Your Say, and that's pretty likely, to be honest, don't forget, we've got a radio edition in an hour or so, and we'll try and do our very best to put you on air then. Also, some of your comments which you call in, we'll put up on the screen during the programme as well. Now, while Jan Egeland was talking, you saw footage there of a protest, a huge protest in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Various causes coming together for that protest. Some Palestinian solidarity, some people turning out to object to the sectarian violence we saw leading to 15 people being killed between Christians and Muslims a week ago. Let's speak to Kamal, who's with us live from Cairo. Kamal, are you supporting those protests?
Yes, I was in Tahrir Square. I just came for the program now.
And what did you see, and what are people demanding?
At the early morning, a lot of Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis went to Tahrir and pray tomorrow. And most of the flags was from Palestinian. But at 10 o'clock, a lot of protesters and youth from revolution came and talking about the conflict between Muslims and the Copts in Egypt. And talking about Muslims and Copts is one hand for Egypt. What you will see now in Tahrir is not only one group. There is a lot of groups and a lot of stages with big speakers. Most of them come from political parties, and some from Muslim Brotherhood. And the main stage is for all activists.
Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Kamal. We appreciate it. Thanks also to Mina from the London School of Economics and Salman, who joined us live from Bahrain. After the news, we'll continue to get your questions for Jan Egeland, former UN humanitarian chief, but we're going to pause for a couple of minutes. Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. Thank you very much indeed for joining me here on World Have Your Say. Our guest is the former UN humanitarian chief Jan Egeland, live from Oslo. A number of questions to put to him. Just before we get into those, I can see various news agencies saying that a Libyan government spokesperson has called reports of Colonel Gaddafi being injured as nonsense, and that's a quote. And here's a message from Ali in Aleppo, that's Syria's second biggest city, who's emailed the BBC to say, "We urge you to prevent American intervention. Most of us want President Bashar al-Assad, and millions of us love him, and this is our right." Well, Ali, judging by what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have been saying about Syria, no prospect of any American military intervention in the near future. And Jan Egeland, I've got to ask you a question which lots of our listeners are interested in. They've seen that the EU today has signalled it'll take up France's idea of allowing restrictions on freedom of movement in exceptional circumstances, such as the number of Tunisians arriving in Italy. Do you think that's reasonable, or should the EU be much more supportive of people whose lives are going through terrible disruption?
Well, I don't like at all what we're doing in and from Europe now. We're restricting movement. Hundreds of people are killed, actually, as they try to enter Europe. They flee from desperate poverty, or they flee from insecurity, like in Libya. This is not the time for more restrictions. This is the time for more openness. At the same time, I think the rest of the world should understand that there is massive unemployment among youth, and it's especially bad in the southern part of Europe, where most people are entering. So it is a real political problem within the European Union.
And as you're talking, we're seeing footage of Libya, and of course, while the majority of people who have arrived in Italy are Tunisians, Libyans have also been making that journey. But the point that people in France are sending to the BBC is, why should Italy and France take the weight here? It's all very well saying from Oslo that Europe should allow freedom of movement, but being realistic, these people aren't going to end up in Scandinavia in any great numbers. They're going to be in Italy and in Switzerland and in France, and as such, it's not fair on those countries. Why should they take the weight?
Well, I am a believer in European solidarity, that there has to be some possibilities for people to go elsewhere in Europe. No, not everybody should be in the same places where they enter. The point with Schengen, the Schengen regime is that if you are able to enter one European country, you can go to others, except if you ask for asylum. Then it's the first asylum country, and of course that's the case often here. They apply for asylum, and then it's the first country. So solidarity has to be given by the rest of Europe to those that receive a lot of people, so that there is a real judging of, assessment of the asylum seekers and whether they have a credible case and a right to stay and seek protection.
But some people watching you will be wondering, maybe the UN should offer to fund the countries who have to support these people. After all, it's a UN-sanctioned move which has created some of the conflict in Libya, for instance. I'm not saying it's created all of the conflict, but it's created some of it by taking military action. Don't you think the UN should offer some financial support to Italy and France and others?
Well, the UN does not have any of its own money. It has to be given that from donor countries. And most of the donor countries are Europeans and, well, North American, Japanese. I cannot see the UN giving priority to Europe, after all, still the richest part of the world, together with North America and Japan. I see European inter-solidarity, and maybe we should spend a little bit more money on receiving people, and then a little bit less money on patrolling and having all sorts of restrictions. I don't like the mood now in Europe. What the public is calling for is actually more and more restrictions, more and more fortresses, more and more walls. When the Berlin Wall fell, we all said, this is the end of the age of walls. This is the new era of freedom of movement.
Mr. Egeland, thank you for responding to that point. Before we put a couple more questions to you, let's shift across back to the World Have Your Say newsroom. Mahfouz is with the team who are taking all of your calls as they come in.
Yes, we're getting calls from all around the world. At this moment, we've got calls from 37 countries. Just in the last few minutes, I saw calls coming in from the US, Iraq, UAE. Callers are expressing their concerns over not just the displacement of people, but also for those protesting against their governments in these countries, the Arab world and North Africa. Though I heard one caller from Bahrain say that he's opposed to the protests taking place there in the recent past, but he's not opposed to legal protests. Finally, a reminder to our viewers that if you want to take part in this conversation, and if you have a Twitter account, use the hashtag WHYS.
Well, let's pick up on that point, Jan Aglin, that callers are making about the welfare of protesters. Is that the UN's job to get involved in trying to assist them, provide medical assistance and communication assistance and anything else?
Well, the UN has a role in protecting human rights around the world. It is what the UN is for. That is to help people enjoy human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly among them. That's why there has to be very strong protest of what is now happening, for example, in Syria, where it's outrageous how security forces attack, arrest, torture innocent protesters. It's not the UN's role to support a protest per se, but it's the UN's role to support the right to protest.
Jan Aglin, I've got someone to speak with you from Saudi Arabia. Ahmed is a blogger in Khobar in Saudi Arabia. Go ahead, Ahmed. What's your point?
Hello?
Go ahead, Ahmed. We're listening.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think the issue of people going from, poor countries to other countries is the responsibility for everybody. I mean, we cannot blame Europe, for example, for being a bit afraid of these issues. If the countries, for example, Libya is having a lot of money over the years, but it's not investing it the right way it should. It's a mature responsibility of these governments as well as the people as well, I think.
Well, let's take that point. We've only got about a minute left, Jan Aglin, but the idea that actually countries like Libya and to a lesser extent Tunisia do have plenty of money compared with some poorer nations in the world, shouldn't they pay to look after people who have been displaced?
Absolutely. I mean, the country in Libya has enormous reserves. The ruler, Gaddafi, has spent them in very bizarre ways very often and should have been better in spending it perhaps on his own people evenly and justly.
I'm sorry,
Tunisia is not a rich country, and most of these countries are not rich.
That's interesting. You just make a distinction between Libya and Tunisia. Thanks for your company. I'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.